generative AI is growing the volumes, okay? So you can do more. So that's really the answer. I produce 1 million of rows analysis, in a month. Now I can do 10 millions with the use of a GenAI tool.
Generative AI is transforming finance, but the teams making the biggest leaps are blending technical rigor with creative thinking, even drawing lessons from the art studio. And today we have Debby Goan, who works at the intersection of advising quant teams and exploring how an artist's perspective can shed new light on generative AI in finance. Welcome to Shaping FinGen AI. I'm Tracy, and as always, I'm joined by Bruno Lorenzelli, founder and CEO of Exchange Robotics and Scalata.ai, building generative AI for financial institutions.
Hello, welcome everyone.
Today, we're asking, as generative AI models commoditize, where does competitive advantage really live? Debby Goan lives between markets and masterpieces, and what we mean by this is as a technologist, advisor, and artist. Debby, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Debby.
Thank you, Bruno.
So before we dive into generative AI, let's set the scene as where you both were, before generative AI really came into the picture. Debby, let's start with you.
Earlier in my career, when I was doing product management and data analytics consulting, but it really starts really early with NLP and unstructured data, turning that into valuable insights that companies can use and transform into tradable signals or features has actually been in process for over a decade, almost maybe over 2 decades now. And I think this really starts with big data kind of coming onto the scene. So when I view sort of the advent of Gen AI and LLMs, it's really the processing power, horsepower that's come into being, not the start of the story, which I think starts with recognizing that data had intrinsic value on its own. And you might remember this, there's this whole period where people were talking about big data lakes, this was like the whole big thing in the early 2000s and 2010. We were already doing a lot of the processing, but only the people who had the capacity, the firepower to process this through a lot of human in the loop. That was really what was happening a lot of this time. You were structuring data, cleaning data. It was quite manual, a lot of labeling work. And what Gen AI really kind of made possible is you don't need as many humans in that loop. You can shift where that human is, and it just became a huge accelerant to what was really already happening with fewer players in making unstructured and alternative data valuable. So where I was already along this train, and when this came along, it was sort of like, oh wow, now we can kind of turn on the spigot and do so much more that we had been imagining for so long.
Yeah. Bruno, you really say the turning point is probably 3-ish years ago when it came to generative AI. Where were you when you felt that shift?
And that was the advent of, obviously ChatGPT, okay? I've been doing this for a while. To me, the biggest transformation, because artificial intelligence has been there for a while, NLP, natural language processing and understanding, BERT models, they've been there in research environments for a very long time, okay? But it was never interesting. Why? First of all, you didn't have the infrastructure, as we mentioned in various episodes here. So today you can just click and build your vector database and you pay $1. Nothing, you pay nothing. Yeah. Before it was like millions of dollars to build one, okay? And so they are still doing it, but they are kind of transitioning now. It will take time. But that's I've always been there. I'm a computer scientist. I always liked it. This is what I like doing. Yeah.
What's interesting that you just reminded me, I think you just sort of triggered in my memory was also realizing, and I've been thinking about this, that COVID and the infrastructure, so the move to cloud, I feel like was a necessary precursor for this to happen. So there had to be developments in order on a sort of a macro infrastructure and how people operated at the big banks. Everybody was in 2015 still actually not on laptops, not in the cloud. There was still the fear of the cloud. But COVID actually sort of changed the regime to allow for something like this so that we could have the scale and the potential for the size of the data that didn't it sort of was a sort of a silent component to this that enabled, I think, Gen AI. And I think the chatbot thing is very, very insightful because that makes it so accessible. I think the people who could access this technology before were so specialized that now anyone, you don't need a PhD to interact with Gen AI.
That's absolutely correct. I support that. Clearly transitioning to the cloud. And the good news is that governments didn't intervene. You know, the only thing they were intervening is data protection. You know, data protection, stuff like that. But there wasn't really a control of this, you know, global, I would say, infrastructure change, you know, such as it was with internet, you know. The cloud was just, you know, a technology transition, you know, in general.
And you were at 2 Sigma in quant finance. When this was starting to evolve, how were you and your team influenced?
You know, I'd always sort of been on the data side, and I joined 2 Sigma early on to actually help facilitate their private equity side of the business, to help build a business. And we also thought about that through the data lens in terms of automating underwriting. So that was kind of the insurance side. And throughout this period, I then also moved on to the traditional investment management side. And there I really thought about data, unstructured data, proprietary data, and how do we take and harness, you know, data in the real world and to turn that into signals that were tradable for our models. It might be helpful to think about the broader uses of data just from that perspective as well.
Was there a moment? Was there a project? Was there a failure or something that happened more on a macro level that you noticed that made a big switch for you?
Yeah, so because I'd been doing stuff in this sort of space for so long, I think one of the things that really made it click, one is there was modeler hype, people that I trusted that were just like, you have to look at this. This is going to be transformative. But 2 is I had benchmark data. The traditional sort of standard is the golden data set would be like a human generated one. Like that's usually the bar. And I had a lot of that because I had been in like data structuring, data labeling for so long that I could very cleanly test the models as they were being made available and accessible inside a corporate institution. And when those test results were coming back and they were meeting or beating the human results, and that we took very, very small slices of testing and just to have clean experiments. And when that started passing consistently, that was the big, like, okay, we have something like very real and potentially production ready. Because there's a lot of experimental tech, there was a lot of stuff in NLP that had been, you know, moving around for a long time, but this felt very viable when it started passing like our benchmark tests.
Tell us what you mean by production ready. How do you, what kind of influence do you need to make in an organization to be able to consider this production ready?
That's a great question. So production is really when it is running, it's running your business in some way, right? So for some organizations, it really means, you know, you probably have different committees, different engineering tests that it has to like provide. You probably need to have some fallback, some security approach to this, but it's really like operating the system that you want it to. So maybe for insights, it's running every day and the person who's supposed to be using it and acting on that insight is able to do it, and it's running sort of in a reliable, consistent manner. For trading, you know, for quant funds, the models are running and they're operating as expected, taking data automatically, turning that into a signal, and then trading it. Like, it is ready to go. And you're an engineer, so you can maybe define it a little bit more technically than I just have. But
no, that's perfect, first of all. Production is basically when you went through several internal steps of approvals and obviously testing and embedding in and blah, 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 so that it's a live product, particularly in financial institutions where Debby worked, and I worked as well, particularly in the last 25 years, to have, models, trading strategies backed by codes. You need to institutionalize these strategies and codes, so they need to be approved. The nice thing about generative AI is that you can produce much faster this content, okay? So you can import data very quickly, in a much cheaper way through the clouds, through the APIs, through the web scraping connections, like the various APIs that are available on the market from Yahoo Finance or Bloomberg or whatever you connect into, or unstructured data if you get the Moody's or the Standard & Poor's and stuff like that. And then you can build your model with obviously, your either internal large language model trained on top of your data, or you can borrow knowledge and you can then execute. Now, the trick at the moment is that unless you invest and spend millions of dollars to build a control infrastructure, it's like a proper production-ready data governance controls around all of these processes, which is the bet where large institutions where they're investing money, then no one is going to trust tools such as ChatGPT, Perplexity, or Gemini, because they're not built for that scope. They're built for raising the awareness and the bar of generative AI or large language models.
Different goals.
That's their scope, their objective. Okay, whereas you need to build it really. And so financial institutions, some of them, they go into the direction of actually building their own.
MCPs.
Yeah. They're building their own platform, spending absurd amount of money on that, or using products. I don't want to advertise Scalata, but yes, or like products like us, where they are very popular. We have lots of competitors in the marketplace, platforms that are trying to obviously deploy a SaaS model. Basically, financial institutions, whether it's a fund or a bank or a service provider or a data provider, can be easily deployed and stuff like that. Now, in order to do that, you need to obviously guarantee certain things, okay? And so those things, is kind of obviously the kind of the decision point there, okay? Most of the big players are partnering with startups. Why? They don't know much. That's the thing. So, yeah, their CTOs are old school. Yeah, they don't know much. They were not born with a GenAI vision and idea. And then, obviously, they already spent an incredible amount of money on things that are working not properly. So that's my understanding. Now, clearly, as in any kind of revolution, or in particular in technology and IT, we are converging towards this view of integrating the entire GenAI new digital layer on top of your processes, operation, legacy system. So you have players such as the CRMs, Salesforce, HubSpot, Dynamics with Microsoft and stuff like that, trying to build, a GenAI infrastructure CRM and then integrating their own customers into that. I think these kind of guys will suffer from a legacy issue problem, okay? Let's say, if you look at, a platform like Perplexity, it's just a wonderful chatbot, they can do with this canvas and many things, very wonderful thing. It's a new way of working. It's a new thing. And instead, you are not looking at a B2B, clickable, like section management. It's a new paradigm, that you have there, okay? And then with that content, then you need to manage that content, right? And so the old school platforms don't have it. They're trying to do something hybrid. And as I mentioned several times, when the car, we had the first automobiles, they look like literally car with horses. They look the same. That's where we are at the moment. Yeah. We are trying to build the new generation platforms.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of the employees and who is in charge of innovating and of taking us to the next level, you mentioned CTOs of legacy companies. Well, let's look at also engineers, at other talent, because I know that actually, Debby, you have some thoughts on this, on what it really takes to innovate and bring in generative AI and financial innovation in general. What kind of talent does that take?
So I think Bruno touched on a lot of really important points there, and underlying a lot of this is change. This is behavioral change management. This is organizational change. This is fundamentally how we interact with certain kinds of technology or get around, in the car example, that is at a very deep and personal level, and then harder at the institutional level, and also at a societal level. You know, I'll leave the societal stuff for Bruno's later chats, but people who can handle change well, I think the people who are the right talent for the future are strong communicators. I think that's really, really important. You don't need to be the best engineer anymore, but you do need to be a really strong communicator. I think being able to interact with humans, I think, becomes increasingly more important even as the tech gets smarter and more capable. I think people who are comfortable with ambiguity. I mean, every new model release is like another shift, forward or different, right? And so the ground doesn't feel stable for a lot of people and a lot of companies. So it's hard to know when you pick your points to get in, but ambiguity and having the ability to kind of have that grit to ride through and continue to be open and to be challenged on this. You know, change is really, really hard, especially at an organizational level. And I've done a lot of sort of innovation and transformation types of initiatives. And the behavior component, designing the incentives properly, the recognition, the tolerance. I mean, change is going to be more than, you're not going to solve this in a month. And I have found on a personal level that often talent that isn't necessarily your A+ student who tested really well and is used to a high structured environment struggles with the ambiguity a little bit. Like psychologically, they get a little bit more stressed, a little bit more, they bring that kind of tension. But I'm interested in people who have, you know, there was a book from a few years ago by David Epstein called Range, and it's about how generalists thrive in the wicked environment. I think we're in a wicked environment. Mm-hmm. The rules are changing, the ground is changing, lots of things are evolving. So I think people who can be nimble and adapt, but also have patience, because you're gonna take, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back constantly for a while, because we're at the beginning of that change. Even though we're a few years in, it's still the beginning of, I think, the transformation of many industries to come.
And you're hiring in New York City right now.
Oh, yeah.
What I mean, in generative AI. So what are you looking for? What do you think is the new excellent student talent hire?
As you know, I basically I created like a spin-off, and I manage 2 companies at the moment. Not just a CEO and raising money and stuff like that. I'm also a computer scientist. I work every day on the testing, on the checks. I have my visions to be deployed, and doing this, kind of in a remote way. I tried several times and it didn't really work well. I wasn't happy with the products. I need to really first time control.
Keeps trying.
Yeah. I started this like in 2020, to be honest. And so while I was building, other platform didn't work. So I was thinking about having a model with a chatbot in 2020 that can actually learn from you and then build your own workflows and platforms. And so I'm happy that this revolution happened, and that now we have the opportunity to have cheaper access to models, to infrastructure, enabling this, but also that the public is more open to that.
And Debby, you've seen a lot of pitches. You're looking from the investment side of things. Where are the use cases? What are teams creating in generative AI right now, and where do you see that moving towards?
I think I was at a conference not too long ago, and there were a lot of vendors selling into funds there, pitching, and I think what's really interesting is a lot of the use cases are very consistent. Mm-hmm. It's like XYZ analyst of some domain. So making a lot of these sort of junior analysts that they can kind of chat with and interact with, and if you take it sort of a level up, I would interpret that as a form of search and summary. It's really like reading through this text that I don't have the capacity and time to, pull out the themes, pull out the stats and the figures that I need, and training it to do it in that way. So that, I think, is one common thing, is like a junior financial analyst for some kind of vertical. Another thing that has been more emergent is this idea of doing some kind of more sophisticated scenario analysis. So analogous situations or events that have occurred in the globe at some point in time that has sufficient data to run comparisons, to run different models against. That's also something that's become, I think, more popular and common and unsurprising. And then you have sort of the operational components of it. I do think there are more, and this is where I don't necessarily, I feel like I'm still thinking about this in my head of whether or not it's really Gen AI or is it really just like process automation. You know, a lot of it's like workflow automation, but like a little bit smarter. And I think there's a lot of benefits just in kind of the unsexy, like clean up this inbox and send these alerts to the right areas and, you know, automate this response for me for these things. But from a financial investment standpoint, I don't know that people are really getting alpha yet out of this. And that financial analyst component, you know, a lot of it's like read these new papers. Can you also, in addition to telling me the themes, tell me how viable this research paper would be as a trading strategy? You know, read all the latest academic new papers coming out from universities and top economists, and like, can I actually turn that into a strategy? Tell me the data sets associated with it. So there's a lot around the idea generation, search and summary, and I would say like thinking about comparing historical analyses in a way that hasn't been really possible or feasible before. That's sort of what I'm saying.
I think, you know, to me, generative AI is growing the volumes, okay? So you can do more. So that's really the answer. I produce 1 million of rows analysis, you know, in a month. Now I can do 10 millions with the use of a GenAI tool. And I'm still under control of it, but then I will produce more. And as a result of that, you know, my financial institutions or my, obviously, organization will have, obviously, more revenues, more production, and more, okay? Now, generative AI is nothing more than producing faster, more automated and accurate information-based, I would say, informed decisions. Nothing more than that, okay? Now, to me, I would love to have this happening sooner rather than later. Why? Because it will grow the global economy, okay? It will support it. So more investments into the economy. In fact, if you look at the last, you know, NASDAQ and S&P 500, they actually realized that. You know, they're investing more money at the moment. It's good news. They're actually investing more money, okay? And also, obviously, more, you know, work on the infrastructural side, you know. Now, obviously, NVIDIA published their new cheap self-driving car. You know, that's a massive revolution, you know. They went into something they were not doing before. And so you can imagine it's limitless, right? Okay? And so that's the way I personally would like to see it.
I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. I think it'll be very disruptive before the growth occurs. I do think, and I'm now putting on, you know, I also own a company as well as advise some, and I do think Main Street is going to be impacted by this. I think the whole K shape is going to get a little bit more K, if you will, because it is so efficient that what I'm seeing from some of the CTOs that I talk to is rather than hiring new talent, they're holding, right? You're actually an exception, I feel like, and maybe some of the AI companies, and I believe the majority of the S&P is being buoyed by these top 10 companies are making up all the gains right now. So it's very highly concentrated value right now. I do think this technology is coming, you know, in a way that is faster than I feel like past transitions have been. I think we will likely end up better off maybe in 10 years or so, but I think it's going to be a rough period for certain industries and roles. I think finance is in a way a little bit insulated. I think some companies are holding steady and either not backfilling or not hiring or doing sort of smaller, I think there's a bit of conservatism because there's a lot of ambiguity in what's happening globally for all these geopolitical and social reasons as well as the technology. What was that MIT article last year? It was 95% of companies have yet to see any AI value, right, as of this summer. And I think there's a desire to doubt the value. So I think there's going to be like a bias against AI from some companies and leaders and the old school CTOs, but the ones who embrace will break out and will get that value. And you'll start to, I think, see more dislocation in some of that sort of dynamic.
We talk about speed. We talk about making money faster, making things happen faster, making the decisions that make money faster.
No, I think it does make it all faster. And I think as a result of making it faster, the consequences are you need less people. Or the effect is, it's not necessarily a consequence, but I'm also seeing actually a lot of data onboarding. So anything routine can theoretically be somehow conceived of as a use case for AI or for an agent or something that's just purely online. And one of the startups that I work with, they started out doing one data set every 2 weeks. So it was a small team. We're seeing smaller teams, I think, in the startup space, and more effective. They're punching above their weight historically because they don't need as many people. They're AI natives. They have been doubling the rate of their data onboarding every week. So you can imagine like a quant fund or even a traditional fundamental discretionary fund that couldn't onboard data before. And maybe you needed like 100 engineers, and now you need 50, and now you need 25, and now you need 10. So I think there's the productivity and the speed at which we're approaching that has implications where when you're a business owner, I don't think you need are you going to go for a 100-person team, or are you going to go for, Good is not the biggest company with the most people anymore. It's sort of like, what's the ROI with kind of the most efficient number of people, and are those people all matter?
Yeah, there is, in general, I would say a use case where you don't just build a chatbot. So you build, you mentioned about data ingestion. You need some sort of a different type of structure, interface, and processing capabilities, like a data lake and codes around that. But if to those 100 people, you offer an opportunity to obviously cover not just that kind of task of data instruction. We're dealing with our customers. That's all they do. They receive, Excel, CSVs. They remap it with their own, CLI code, and they push it back to the legacy. And we just automate that kind of thing. Well, we don't want these guys to go away. We want these guys actually to execute the entire workflow. And you can see that in the last 6 months, and we started actually in our firm to do this 2 and 3, it was the concept in general. So they started to create this chatbot link. You can share the ChatGPT or Gemini link, and then you can share with you can co-work on the same chat, stuff like that, okay? Clearly, they don't have a platform, so they just share the link. It's highly non-compliant because it's like no one in a financial institution should ever use that kind of technology. I don't know why they did it, but they were just copying things from startups like mine.
You know what though? I think that is part of the risk with talent is that they've been so narrow they didn't realize they don't have the common sense.
It's like
no,
we've been doing this for like a while. The sharing of co-working on the same. We have a data governance, a data control, and basically alerts and permission based. And so they just did it, and no one is saying anything, like incredible. So they just do it. There's no regulation, anywhere in the world. They say you can't do this actually.
But someone who works in proprietary data, I know that data, when data is your most precious, aspect of your firm that you have. You know that, right? You are the people that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know that, but it's hard to remember. Sometimes I think for some of the smartest folks, I'm like, did you just say that out loud? It's hard because I think one of the things with the consumer, and going back to one of Bruno's points way early in the conversation, is the goal of the interface and these, Gemini and Perplexity and maybe less Perplexity and more ChatGPT is to get you to chat with it, right? And in a way, they're almost replacing relationships and like feedback loops and things like that, that behavior taken into an institution level needs to be thought of differently. And that's hard. That's hard for a human to kind of shift who they are, and if they're trained in one way in one environment to go to the other. And remember, there's a lot firms can do with the data governance, with training, with actually deploying certain maybe proprietary technologies and sort of tracking and monitoring. But it's hard, and it's designed to be hard.
What would we be remiss to not mention in this conversation or ask? My big question is, as an artist, right? We have an artist. We don't always have an artist talking about finance and an expert in finance. As an artist, what kind of perspective has that brought?
I usually kind of keep those two worlds slightly segregated in the sense that art is like a way of making a mess, while work is a way of like being organized, getting that data clean and ready. But I think some of the ways that art has contributed to just generally how I think about finance and data is, if you ever tried to draw like a face, you don't think about a face in terms of eyelashes or an eye or an eyelid or an eyebrow. You're supposed to think about it as planes of light. And only by abstracting your own mind and thinking about how you react to the form can you actually draw something that looks realistic. So it's sort of ironic, like you need to move away from like the literal definition. And I think one of the things I've learned through the process of just like cleaning and structuring data and working with human in the loops for so long is that like humans will do things you don't expect. And really being open-minded about that and sort of understanding data is really a pattern. Language is a pattern and structure, and if you can move away sometimes from the text itself, you can get very creative with what you derive or create. And I'm gonna go back early because I realized one thing that Bruno and I kind of jumped right into is how much this is accelerating some really interesting development in the world that I didn't give like a real use case, but I'll give you one from like way back when. I remember meeting with a commodities firm, and they owned everything from soil level data to the transit of grains to an actual commodities trading desk. And one of the sort of projects that I had was, could they come up with a trading signal from raw soil data, right? And you can start thinking about, well, what does that signal mean? How do you label it? And back in the day, someone would look at that data and have to check, is it good, bad, is it neutral? Something like that. I mean, I'm not giving the best structure, but there's an idea of like labeling used to be human. Can you imagine how many data points that might be around the US and how hard and labor intensive? It's doable, but it's not feasible. And so what you have now is a way to actually do that efficiently and at scale, but you have proprietary data that's a moat that you could, and there's probably regulations around that to think about and all that. But these are the kinds of projects people have been dreaming about for years that we've been sitting on for over decades. That have been, like think about matching that to weather data and then predicting where do you think commodities is going to go and over what time frame. Like that is powerful stuff. So there is a lot of value still to be now explored in this space that hasn't been so far.
If I gave you a blank check to create any proprietary data set that doesn't exist today, for both of you, what would that be?
I don't know if this exists, but I think something in the legal space around like judgments, around like micro level. I want something that has some speed of change on like a regular frequency that has societal implications. And I don't think anyone's gone through like court cases and documents and liens and judgments. Like that could be like a really interesting data set that would be very hard to construct. How about you?
How about you?
Well, With me, it wouldn't cost much. I can do it for a very small charge.
What type of data?
I'd say that the credit data is the one that is still matters today, you know, and because it's primarily based on people's movement, generally globally, okay. Particularly, you know, the country like United States, we have lots of immigrants coming in and with no data. You know, I'm one of them, you know? Yeah, and so you need to build credit history, you need to understand their behavior, you need to basically see where they lived, and the most 90% of them, they reach their bumps, basically, they have no money. And so that's difficult, you know? And so that will bring an incredible amount of value to small financial institutions that have to deal with these kind of residential domestic issues in general. So that's what I think it's an incredible value. What's your impression about adopting, you know, generative AI more in kind of, you haven't experienced unstructured data, you know,
Yeah.
but more in the kind of the traditional financial markets and equity and side of things, okay?
I think there's a lot of public pressure to say that you are doing this. I think there is a lot of top-down initiatives being kicked off. I don't know how effective things will be. I think people are trying. I think people have access to it, right? I think everyone's going to say you have, you know, access to this on your desktop and you should try it. And I'm sure every major firm has multiple AI initiatives going on, if not for managing public perception and optics and also not feeling left behind. But I think the hard part will be articulating how they measure that value. I think that's going to be interesting, because what are you benchmarking off of? I think that's really hard, because I don't think people captured that data, how long it took me to do XYZ before. So the cycle to that actual change, I would guess, has to be at least 18 months to 2 years at minimum before real numbers show up. I think you're going to get a lot of little internal things that say, I saved 4 hours on this, and this used to take 10 people, now it takes 2. And I think they'll be almost anecdotal. But I think that's also the natural way of institutions. You know, and I think you're going to probably see certain leaders be further ahead than others. And, you know, I'm going to go back in time again, but one of the leaders on a project I did where we took unstructured data and did automated recommendations for financial advisors. So we took that, we took all this internal firm data, we used the same team, you know, the Netflix prize early in the 2000s, we had the same sort of modeling team help us develop an algorithmic way to come up with recommendations to be more effective as an FA. And that leader who spearheaded that project at this major bank, you know, is now the CIO, or I think one of the CIOs of the bank, but was very, very forward thinking. You know, I think this was 15 years ago. So I think some of those people are there in places in these different seats, and I think the payoff will be long. But we're going to hear more noise and excitement about it now, because they have to, right? There's too much pressure not to say that, and you won't really know. And I think people are trying. I don't know how successful they'll be in the short term, but they almost have to be successful in the long term.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think I agree with you. They don't want to move their chair and desk very much, though.
No.
So they come. Okay. I know I have this kind of impression too. Ma, what is going to be the kind of the big technology news within the GenAI in 26? What do you think is going to be like the hot topic? Last year they started with agents, agentic agents. Everyone now is doing agents, you know? Like we are in the secret service of LLM and GenAI, you know? Now, what is going to be 26 in your opinion?
That's a really great question. I could speculate. I think one of the things that I've heard that is interesting to me is that the way that you deploy platforms will be different. That every interface can now, because deploying a product is so easy, you know, that you can have the sort of the same core platform, but every user has their own interface and their own it used to be, I think widgets were a very common term. I think it'll have a new term around it, but more custom interfaces with core lying under infrastructure being the same, but that you can now rapidly deploy products in 1 day life cycle kinds of things. I think that could be really compelling. I don't know. What's your thought?
I think there are two techs in 26. I think there will be a new generation of data centers and data processing capabilities, cheaper and faster, okay? I think we'll see by the end of the year, you see Google, release the TPA and we're gonna have a new product. I think one of the big players like Microchips or Taiwan Semiconductor or whatever is going to issue some sort of photonic side of things, okay, to power the GenAI infrastructure. I think they are working on it, okay? That's one of the first things that I see changing. Different data lakes, totally different data lakes. You see Microsoft Fabric, they're going into a new set of way of processing and storing data, okay? Cheaper, faster, more integrated with GenAI. I think if you look at Slack, if you look at Teams, you will look at that kind of integration. And we offer that kind of thing interface already, okay? We just need to optimize it. That inference AI is the bet of 26. So it's basically optimizing the agentic framework into making decisions on your behalf. It's not just building a workflow with the agents. It actually makes a decision, And that requires a level of configuration and control that is not easy. So agents today, they can build credit memos. They can do financial analysis, as you may say, an agent financial, but they're actually not acting as an independent, kind of thing. Yeah, there are so many that are like kind of mock-ups that are all really real. Yeah.
But it's close. You can imagine it to be real by the end of the year.
These are two people to follow if you want to know about what's going to happen in the future of AI. I know that you guys are very humble about it, but I think that your intuition is just mind-blowing. And if you want a demo, Bruno's your guy. He will. Oh, I bet you are waiting to and willing to show people really what the future of AI is, generative AI in finance. So feel free to reach out to Bruno, Scalata.ai, DebbyGoan.com. Also, will get you to see some of Debby's art, but also follow her on LinkedIn for all of her work and thoughts and ideas in finance.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debby. Thank you for coming.